Of course, strictly speaking, I was not the only person to have witnessed World War III. A small number of senior military personnel in the NATO and Israeli and Iranian high commands, as well as President Trump, Prime Minister Netanyahu, Grand Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and their aides, and the military officers who decrypted the nuclear launch codes and sent the missiles on their way into unknown regions of the Arab Sea, were well aware that war had been declared and that a ceasefire agreed 4 minutes later. But I have yet to meet a member of the ordinary public who has heard of World War III. Whenever I refer to the war, people stare at me with incredulity. Several parents have withdrawn their children from the pediatric clinic, obviously concerned for my mental stability. Only yesterday, one mother to whom I casually mentioned the war later telephoned my wife to express her anxieties. But Andresa, like everyone else, has forgotten the war, even though I've played video recordings to her of the Fox, MSNBC, and CNN newscasts of the 23rd of June, which actually announced that World War III had begun.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to Bungacast. It's the end of June 2025, and this is our end-of-month episode. I'm Alex Hochuli, and I'm with fellow Bunga boy George Hoare. We're basically two guys that have been podcasting for so long and so hard that we don't know what the fuck we're doing. Hello, George.
Hey, yeah, podcasting here from the bunker. But yeah, I did like your creative opening to the episode.
Yeah, owe that to J.G. Ballard's The Secret History of World War III, adapted for our present purposes in 2025. So I don't know if you've been monitoring the situation, George, but let me just outline for listeners what we're going to be talking about today. Firstly, a bit of context on the Iran war that didn't really happen, but sort of is still happening, but might yet happen, but also maybe not. The origins of sanewashing. We'll move on then to U.S. political polarization between Jacksonian or Jeffersonian on the one hand and Hamiltonian on the other hand, the decline of left versus right and what all this means. We'll briefly preview what's coming up next month. And then, of course, the latter half of this episode dedicated to Letters to the Editor, where we deal with your questions and comments from the past month. Lots of juicy ones. Thank you, as always, for sending them in. Looking forward to getting onto that. But before that, I guess I need to ask George, how's the neck? You feeling that whiplash? If you're monitoring the situation, as the phrase now goes, over the past few weeks. I should note that we're recording this on the 25th of June, in case, the world has blown up and you're listening to this from your bunker, having survived.
Yeah, if so, good luck to you. No, the Iran war did not take place, I think is the official line, the Baudrillardian line. No, it's yeah, I do I like Trump's chutzpah in the face of potentially globally catastrophic events. He just tells people off and tells people that they don't know what they're doing because they've been doing it for too long and too hard. And it's like, well, yeah, sometimes you just need an angry American guy to shout at people and get the situation resolved.
Exactly. Well, he's like wrong 98% of the time, but that 2%, he really, really nails it home. But yeah, it's all just like the old mysterious Frenchman prophesized, particularly Baudrillard, who you mentioned, and Guy Debord to a certain extent as well, because there's a question about whether this 12-hour war was actually just pure spectacle. I haven't made my mind up about it. So we were actually going in this episode to talk about the ins and outs of the US/Israeli and Iran war, but that's mercifully on hold for now, though of course by the time this reaches your ears, maybe not. Anyway, congrats everyone for the courage, stamina, and intelligence to have forgotten what no one other than the US president is calling this 12-hour war, 12-day war, which has ended in 12 hours, but then not, because the Israelis continued, and then Mr. Trump had harsh words for them. So a lot of the discussion has concerned, obviously, Trump, to a certain extent, his people, and even his supporters' apparent pivot from an isolationist America First position to a new 2000-style neocon one. J.D. Vance even announced, I don't know if you saw this, George, he announced, "I empathize with Americans who are exhausted after 25 years of foreign entanglements in the Middle East. I understand the concern, but the difference is that back then we had dumb presidents." If that isn't techno-populism, I don't know what is. That's perfect. It's like, so now you have the smart, most qualified leader to implement the correct solution, do war properly.
Yeah, do war quickly, get it over and done with in 12 hours, bam.
Others were concerned to note that unlike the rush to war in Iraq, there was little attempt to manufacture consent for another regime change and nation-building experiment in Iran. As someone joked on X, they didn't even have the courtesy to false flag us this time. This is obviously a step change in Western-led savagery, to be understood in tandem with support for Israeli slaughter and carnage in Gaza. Elites don't even have to concern themselves with making a show of tending to domestic constituencies anymore. Of course, viewed from the light of today, on the 25th of June, we can say, actually, no, this was all part of Trump's grand plan. It was the art of the deal, play brinkmanship, threaten war and regime change, and then all sides can back down. There was no manufacturing consent because there was never going to be full-scale US attack on Iran. This shows that actually domestic constituencies are important and relevant because Trump was elected, in part, on an isolationist platform. They dare not even have tried manufacture consent because they know that wouldn't fly. The MAGA proposition is still intact. I think it's quite obvious. I mean, I'm satirizing these positions because neither of these positions really hold. I think both of them seem like ex post facto justification. The picture's a lot more confused. So, yes, Trump speaks more harshly to the Israelis than past US presidents, but he's hardly reined in Netanyahu. Trump marks a break with the neocon tendency in the Republican Party, yes, but he's hardly anti-war or against the projection of US power. So I actually think, kind of reflecting on the bizarre nature of the past 2 weeks, I suppose, is that to read too much strategy into what we're seeing would be to mistake what is actually an assemblage of clever tactics and perhaps even internal conflicts at the top of the US state manifesting themselves, and to misunderstand that as strategy. And to do that would be to engage in something that I learned is called sanewashing. More on that in just a second. But we did discuss this notion in an episode on Trump's tariffs, which I recorded with Lee Jones back in April. There's a temptation to say that everything that Trump does is crazy, reactive, senseless. And there's an opposing tendency to say it's all part of a grand strategy, that he knows what he's doing, he's in control. To paraphrase Lee Jones and his take on the matter, which regards tariffs, but it probably applies just as much to this question of the Iran war, is that some claim to discern a master plan at work, but then anybody discussing it as such inevitably gets denounced by the first camp as sanewashing Trump. But if a detailed grand strategy seems implausible, nor does it seem wise to retreat to an account based purely on irrationality. Corey Robin suggested on this podcast and elsewhere that with Trump, anything is possible, so everything is plausible, which is a nice line, but maybe that doesn't provide us with the sort of analytical traction and political guidance we need at this moment. So the truth is somewhere in between, and I think we will have to apply that analysis when we come to discussing Iran later this month. George.
Yeah, I guess one of the problems with saying that anything is possible, so everything is plausible, is it doesn't. That can be used at any point in time. It doesn't enable you to produce a model that could predict what will come next. And there must be, I think, maybe I'm in the sanewashing camp, but there must be a model of political action that can be applied to contemporary American politics, including America's president. You know, what are the political alliances and constraints that Trump and Trumpism operates under? What's the constituent parts of the worldview? What are the constituencies that have to be appealed to? And yeah, maybe there is what you could call an emergent strategy, which is sometimes a phrase used to describe a master plan that comes out of or can be inferred from a set of more instinctual or seemingly unconnected tactics or actions. But I think the Trump derangement syndrome is much less with Trump 2.0 than it is Trump 1.0. But the goal still has to be to explain, and respond to political changes and the challenges of explaining exactly how Trump is operating. I guess is perhaps greater than Biden, but equally, with Joe Biden, what was going on there? There is a
what was going on there? Yeah, no,
and I don't think people well, maybe people were accused of sane washing or compost mentis washing or whatever the right washing would have been at that point in time. Yeah, I mean, I think particularly with this, I'm kind of glad that we are not doing an episode entirely on the kind of Iran war, because it seems very much too early to tell what really, whether this has worked, Trump's kind of spectacular tactics, and also what will happen in the longer term. But I'm,
I mean, we're not going to do the predictions, and in fact, I should say we're going to be. It's not that we're not discussing Iran like ever. It's that we're doing a dedicated episode on Iran in the coming weeks at the start of July with Eskander Sadeghi. He's a specialist on Iran and its international relations. So we'll be looking at the U.S. encirclement of Iran, whether a war is likely, what the strategies and end games of the various parties look like, and indeed how this is playing out domestically within the Islamic Republic. So I'm really looking forward to doing that. That will be coming to you, listener, in the next week or two. I mean, just two things on what George has said. One, I'm not sure if there's a model for Trump, is because precisely a model suggests laws and regular mechanisms of action which can be predicted, and I don't think it's that. I mean, there's obviously a lot of chaos in the policy making, a lot of internal contradictions which are reflected by different interests and different ideological camps within his administration, and there's different ways to characterize this, which we're going to get onto, actually, at least one way of talking about it and why that may or may not be correct. But I want to just quote from a piece which came out, I think, today by Sohrab Ahmari in Unheard. Did Iran win the 12-day war? And you can read that for yourself, but just the concluding point, I think, is relevant to what we've just been saying here. Maybe American support isn't all that necessary anymore to Israel. Maybe Trump's permanent ceasefire will hold. Maybe Washington and Tehran will make a deal that will satisfy hardliners in Washington and Jerusalem. Then again, it's telling that American hawks are already complaining about the ceasefire and insisting that nothing short of regime change will do. But younger cohorts of security professionals, Republican and Democrat, have had more than enough. Their dissatisfaction is likely to crystallize into a hard determination to avert a repeat of the 12-day war gambit. None of Israel's spectacular battlefield and intelligence victories, I suspect, can compensate for this generational political loss. I think that's good because it identifies a clear tendency in American foreign policy making and the shifting strength and weaknesses of alliances, and particularly with regard to Israel, which I think, as many people have pointed out, is due to weaken because younger cohorts are no longer so wedded to Israel at all costs, right? Like as it's been characterized, I think, kind of jokingly, like America first, but first Israel, or America first, and that's why we have to support Israel. So I think these things are changing, and that's a good way to characterize a tendency, but which leaves open a lot of short-term possibility of things spiraling in different direction because of different the kind of constellation of different interests, and a president whose modus operandi is, again, tactics over strategy. So I just want to briefly touch on what the sane washing idea is, because we had a listener, Eli. I actually asked him. No, it's not Eli S. It's Eli S. I was mispronouncing it. Anyway, he writes in to say that sane washing comes from a 2022 Substack post by someone called Inverse Florida, which my reading of it and reading of that Substack seems to be that they're like a former leftist, but now self-declared neoliberal, interested in criticizing radical subcultures. So kind of a reformed leftist, but now neoliberal, centrist, anti-radical. Anyway, but the piece is kind of interesting, and I'm just going to try to summarize from that piece, because I wasn't familiar with this term, and its origin actually surprised me a little bit. So in this post, Inverse Florida discusses the politics around defund the police as a slogan and a demand, and how there's an overlap between political milieus. So to quote from it, the social network overlap of leftists with mainstream progressives creates an incentive for mainstream progressives to quote-unquote sane wash leftist slogans or activism. Rhetoric will spread so readily from hard leftist spaces to mainstream progressives because it spreads through the social justice warrior space, and it spreads by the same dynamic of implication of strong consensus, of a long history of established truth, and an implication of guilt if you can't get with a program. I'm sure everyone's encountered this before. So, well, it's 2025 now. You must, such and such, as if it were self-evident, and everyone must agree, although it's quite a radical demand, right? So that's how defund the police can be spread up through hard leftist spaces into mainstream progressive spaces. Defund the police, or indeed, abolish the police, and various kind of anti-carceral policies around that, which are quite radical statements. Whether wherever you find yourself on the matter, I think it's utopian in the kind of classical sense of the word. But nevertheless, these are things which you would expect if you want to advance them. You have to understand that they're quite radical demands, but they're often presented, particularly as they enter mainstream kind of centrist discourse, as kind of self-evident things which everybody's got to get on board with. Otherwise, you're, bad thing, bigoted in some way. What happens is that people go, well, obviously the arguments that people are making are insane and not what people actually believe or mean. But think of them as saying more reasonable thing. If you're sane washing, you won't let people make their argument for themselves. You'll do it for them, and you'll do it often, presenting the most reasonable version of what the people in your social group are pressuring you to believe, so that you can still do activism properly without surrendering the beliefs that you'd be guilty for not having. Right? So there's a little bit of a push and pull, a kind of concealment of some elements of a more radical position, and a spelling out of the kind of more moderate or reasonable version of that. It's a kind of a version of the Mott and Bailey argument as well. This is something that the right does as well. So conservatives have sane washed the groomer discourse, for instance, right? That there's like groomer predators everywhere, blah, blah, blah. And then kind of more mainstream right-wing figures go, no, what they actually mean is such and such, it's actually something far more reasonable. Have you encountered this? And do you think, how do you think also this relates to the Trump question, right? Of how people, quote unquote, sane wash Trump?
Yeah, I mean, long-time listeners will know that we had a rather heated discussion about Mott and Bailey arguments, not really about anything more than the construction of early modern, late medieval kind of fortifications and castles. Yeah, I mean, I am a little bit. I find this an unwieldy term, and it's not one that I think I would ever use against somebody. So the idea is that more kind of politically central people have like ventriloquized more radical people in a way that benefits them, right? Is that what? Because I guess the like to kind of talk about like greenwashing, that's when my understanding of it is when for example, evil corporation, which is pumping oil into the rivers, that would be the kind of the Captain Planet version, but more realistically, particularly in Britain today, it's just dumping sewage into the rivers. They have some token initiatives that allow them to portray themselves in a very environmentally friendly way. But here, the sane washer and the sane washee, if that's the right word, are different people, right? So you're doing it on behalf of someone else.
Yeah. Or I think, I guess there's two ways to see this. One is that the kind of center, because it would be like, insofar as center means what is moderate, accepted, reasonable opinion, which, as we know, centrism is often not very moderate or reasonable at all. But anyway, assuming that the center kind of in some ways is a more moderated version of what its relative wings would be like, it kind of, one version is like, it goes and takes, for example, some nutty far left sect says, some like Maoist or black nationalist or whatever is like, we should kill all white people and have China take over America or something. And the sane washing would be to say, well, okay, there's all these people on the street saying that, but of course they don't literally mean that. What they mean is that there should be a counterbalance to US power, and that racism is a serious problem in American society, right? So that you've just kind of sane washed this thing which is quote unquote insane. But I think that's, and therefore, and what I think is neat about this Substack is that it explains how, these kind of things which are quite extreme and come from small leftist milieus enter kind of mainstream, soft, progressive, center left discourses and communications. Right. And often I know people on this podcast have made the point like, oh, they're the same thing. They're all wokes or whatever. But it's like, no, but they're actually different milieus. Right. And there's a way that one thing passes into the other. And again, the same most likely happens on the right, though I'm less familiar with it. But I think this is kind of different to the way that sane washing is used when discussing Trump, right? And because of the question of strategy and tactics, because what we were discussing regarding the tariffs and brought up again now with regard to the Iran war is that what you're seeing is like quite chaotic, undoubtedly, indisputably chaotic actions which push one way and then the other, and which are a series of tactics, but it's not clear whether they amount to a proper strategy because there's so many loose ends and unpredictable moments, which if they had gone some in a different direction, would have prevented the next step in the tactics from being implemented. So it's definitely chaotic. And so people go then and go, yes, but it's all part of a grand strategy. Is sane washing, not in the sense of like making something more moderate, but making something more coherent. And I guess that's the difference in the application of it. But anyway, I don't know if I'll be using the term sane washing at any rate, but I just found it interesting to be put onto the history of the term.
Hello friends, you've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/Bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original, exclusive episodes with the entirety of the Bungacast cast. That's George Hoare, myself Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gurevich, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the Bungacast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage Magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/Bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.
De A ou pas se taire.